Everybody, good evening, good evening. Your host, Jed Applerouth. Excited to spend most of an hour with you all talking about testing, answering questions. Got a good presentation queued up for you all, and then there'll be Q&A at the end. We have a pretty good group tonight, and hopefully we'll have some good Q&A. One note, we always record these, and we're going to send out a link. It'll have a link to this presentation. You can watch it again, share it with your spouse, or watch with your kids, and hopefully that'll be helpful. So I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds, let the room fill up a little more, and about 100 signups. But I know we'll have some folks watching tomorrow or the next day. But I think we'll give it another few seconds as people come in the room. But again, those who just jumped in, we're going to have a recording of this that will mail out within a day or so once we render it all and edits the beginning and end out. And then we're going to have Q&A at the end. We have time for a good Q&A after I go through the slides. But I think that's about it. So let's go ahead and jump in. And we're going to be doing questions through the Q&A. That'll be okay. Oh, and also there's a poll. Short and sweet, 2 questions. Are you a parent, student, educator? If you are a parent or a student, what grade are you in? That's it. Short and sweet. Bam, bam, 2 questions. We'll have a poll at the end also for people who want a follow-up or more information. I'm happy to reach out to you all or send you more things if you want. All right, so that's our introductory. Let's do it. So the world we live in is a test optional world for the most part. Test required has been slowly trickling back, but I think now the number is about 2,000 schools are test optional, which is a big number. That does not mean that tests are not going to strengthen or impact your application, but you have the option to submit or not submit at the vast majority of schools, with the exception of some of the most selective schools in the country have returned test required, and we think that trend will continue this year and in the coming years. So the world we live in, the SAT is back on top. I remember about 10 years ago, the ACT was the dominant test, but the SAT recovered nicely from the pandemic. The ACT remained flat. The SAT has made some big changes in the past couple of years. It's gone totally digital. And the ACT announced and rolled out their most recent changes in September. All the tests domestically went to the new format versus internationally, there's still a little delay until the spring. But things are moving, and we'll see what happens with this duopoly as they go forward. So there are, every now and again, we get the news update. In October, we learned that Princeton had returned to test required, and it's joining 7 of the 8 Ivy League schools, as well as Stanford, as well as Caltech, UT Austin, MIT. A lot of great schools, Johns Hopkins. A lot of the best schools in the country are test required, and every year we're going to add several more. Additionally, to the big private schools, the big state schools are coming back to testing, especially in the South. We're seeing a pretty meaningful return. All the Florida schools, the top 8 Georgia schools, all the schools in Tennessee, Auburn, UT Austin, Ohio State. And we anticipate this trend will continue more. The flagships, when you look at their admit rates for out-of-state students, it's pretty mind-blowing how competitive these schools are. Like looking at like UNC, UVA, Texas, even Georgia, the out-of-state numbers are amazing. And just how many kids want to go to these big sports, big schools in the SEC, and they're getting incredibly competitive. And when they're pulling so many applications for a small number of spots, many of them are going back to test required to manage the incredible influx of applications. But again, like schools like UNC, out of state, they're letting in like 10% of kids, 8% of kids. UT Austin, it's the same thing. It's really, so they're just getting so many kids with amazing grades and amazing, a lot of academic rigor. And so they're putting testing back as a requirement to help differentiate and distinguish which kids are really the strongest, and also as a balance to all the grade inflation that we've been seeing throughout the country. All right, and this is the calendar. I've been keeping this since Georgia went back. I live in Atlanta. Within a year of the pandemic, Georgia went back test required. Then quickly thereafter, Georgetown, MIT, Tennessee, Purdue. The huge influx of schools came about in 2024. It was February when suddenly there was new research which came out from the Opportunity Insights Group out of Harvard. Raj Chetty, brilliant economist, had this huge research release for looking at like 1.5 million applications to the Ivy League. and looking at what predicts performance, and they found out that your high school grades are a weaker predictor of performance in the Ivies compared to your testing. And then suddenly Dartmouth went back, and Yale, and Brown, and Harvard, Cornell, all these schools went back. And then in the last year, we've seen Miami, Penn, Ohio State, Carnegie Mellon, Auburn, and Princeton. So just kind of getting a sense of the flow of this. Looks like we're getting about 5-6 schools every year, and I expect more of the same next year as schools run out their post-pandemic experiment with test optional. Schools that are very, very selective, many of them are now putting back into place testing requirements, and we expect that to keep going. Even schools like University of California, it was a big deal when they went test blind, but just recently there was research out of UC Davis showing how many kids coming into UC Davis with really good grades are incredibly remedial with the mathematics. They're blind to test scores, but they're kids coming in with A averages in math. When they get there, they need 8th grade algebra. And so it's like, holy cow, we can't trust these grades that we're getting. So I wouldn't be surprised. And there's a recommendation at UC Davis to put test requirements back in place. So even though UC is test blind with UCLA, UC Berkeley, there's a push from the academics to get testing back because it does protect certain kids who don't belong there from getting in. And if a student has a 450 on math, they're probably not ready for college level math at some of these top schools. And that's why testing can do a service and help the schools. So if you're curious about what schools might return test required, this slide I've had up, this is from earlier in the year, and you look at, there's something called the Common Data Set, CDS. You can look up any school in the country. They're required, if they receive federal funds, to fill out this Common Data Set. Type in Princeton Common Data Set, and you go under the category for applicants, and it's like B20, and it'll tell you what percent of students who are currently enrolled in the freshman class sent test scores. And whenever that number gets to be around 70%, that's when you start saying, oh wow, this admissions office really does favor testing. And very often, looking at the schools who are not test required, many of them are in the category where the submitters, if you add up SAT, ACT, it was around 70%. And then within a couple of years, boom, they're test required again. Because these numbers, there are schools that are also very selective where the percent of submitters is much, much lower, like 30%, where they're obviously admitting classes with less preference to test score submission. But when you have an admissions office that really favors testing, they may be considering going back test required. So Princeton was the test optional, and now they're not. Penn was optional, and now they're not. I'm looking at UChicago. I'm looking at UVA, UNC, Emory, and schools like this may revert back, and they're more likely to, given the fact that so many kids who they enroll sent test scores. All right, the rationale, why are schools going back? Dean of Admissions at MIT, Stuart Schmill, said that we can't tell who's going to do well at MIT without those test scores along with grades. And they found that kids with under a 700 on the math score are the ones failing out of MIT. They may have A's in high school, but that strong score in math helps them predict who's ready for MIT level work. Same thing at Brown. This is the research out of Harvard with Rod Shetty. The test scores are a better predictor. Same thing at Yale, same thing at Dartmouth, and the same thing at UT Austin. That grades, the high school grades aren't as good of a predictor. This is a slide from Opportunity Insights, which was honestly the rationale for test requirements. That on the left side, testing as a predictor of college GPA. On the bottom of the x-axis, you see the test scores going up from 1200 to perfect score. And on the left, you see the rise in grades in college. And kids with a 1200 SAT, their average GPA, again, for hundreds of thousands of students, was a 3.2. And the kids with a perfect score, they were getting almost a 3.7. And so oh, wow, for these schools that are very selective, test scores are very predictive of performance. Nice, good line, nice, strong R squared, explaining the difference in the variable. But look at high school grades. Kids with a 3.1 in high school, their average GPA was around a 3.45, versus with a 4.0 in high school, their average was around a 3.55. Much a weaker predictor. And there's a lot of grade inflation, and the higher grades are not predicting better performance in college, whereas test scores are. So that's why the Ivies went back, and that's why many schools are going back. UT Austin, big state school, they, tens of thousands of kids. And they found that for those students who sent test scores versus those who did not send test scores, those with scores were much less likely to be on probation academically. And the real kicker, people who sent test scores, all things being equal, they had GPAs that were 0.86 grade points higher. So that's amazing. That means that if two kids had a 3.5 GPA in high school, the ones who sent test score, let's say they had on average a 3.6, 3.6 GPA, versus the kids who didn't send test scores had 2.7. So it's a very meaningful difference. And so kids with test scores just did better at Texas, which is why they said we are now test required. So that's part of it. Additionally, I live down the street from Emory. My daughter goes to school right next door. John Ladding is the dean. He said, you know what? We don't trust GPA these days. Grades are definitely inflated. And so we're going to be weighing other assessments more heavily. That's going to be the AP scores as well as the SAT scores. And Emory is a school that does put some weight on those test scores. So in the grand scheme of things, testing, it still matters. It still has an effect, even though it's optional at many schools. And it especially matters when you're looking at like STEM schools, like the MITs and the Caltechs and Carnegie Mellons. If you are an aspiring engineer, that math score makes a difference. It really shows, are you ready for some of the higher level math? If you can't do math on the SAT, you're going to probably struggle with the really advanced mathematics and differential equations and multivariable it's really hard math they're doing. If you can't do basic math, that's going to be a challenge. So additionally, we have the merit-based aid is really a factor for making college more affordable. And if you have good test scores, that factors in at many schools. One school I mention quite often is Alabama, because they're very generous with merit-based aid. My niece applied to Alabama. She had a 1390 SAT, and of course a very strong GPA, like a 4.0 or so, unweighted 3.9, whatever it was. But she was given the UA Scholar Award. And so that takes tuition, and she lives in Richmond. So tuition would have been $33,000 a year. But with that award, tuition was knocked down to roughly $8,000 or so a year, which is a savings of $96,000, which is amazing. And so Alabama, it's incredible what they've done with their incoming class. It's so academically robust, much stronger students, higher GPAs, because they're so generous with their merit-based aid. So testing can factor in there. And the question then becomes, should I prioritize testing? It's optional. How much does it really make a difference? Well, be mindful that it's optional, but many things are optional that are still impactful. Academic rigor, leadership, AP score submission, it's all optional. But if I send a bunch of strong AP scores, that option can have an impact. And there was a moment in time when test optional was new for a lot of these schools that had been test required for 50 years and more. And when they were being very candid and sharing data, all this has stopped. They stopped sharing this data. But for a couple of years in 2021, 2022, there were schools who were saying, okay, we have different admit rates for kids with and without test scores. Now, this is all very tight. They hold it close to their chest. And then when Yale, when they went back to test required, they said, you know what? We've been admitting students they were test optional officially, but the admit rate was 3 times with test scores than without, even while they were totally optional and telling everybody it's optional. They weren't saying we're test preferred, but they were admitting kids 3 to 1. Boston College, they said we were optional and they were admitting kids, 29% admit rate with test scores and 11% without. They finally changed their guidance and said we're test preferred. Colgate, the admit rate was double. Their Dame, Emory is double, UVA is almost double. But then there are schools like Vandy where the admit rate is not double. And so again, Vandy's selective, very selective, but the admit rate with test and without doesn't really vary that much. And so that's they have a different philosophy. So that's one of those things where you don't always know, does optional mean we prefer it or not? They're not candid anymore. And so, but we have this data which shows that some schools definitely have a lean towards tests and admissions. So we're seeing some changes, a little bit of language shifting as they're getting more transparent. Brunel said submitting scores may help you. If you don't, this information. Boston College, they were test optional. Now they said, those who have it are encouraged to submit. So if you see a word encouraged or it'll help you, that's a clue. Unless you're a first-gen student or someone from a very school that's not highly representative for the school. Tufts is being very transparent, which I think is fabulous. They said if you have a 1300 or 28, send it. And that's lovely. My niece, she applied. She was looking at schools, looking at Tulane, looking at UNC, looking at a bunch of schools. The Tulane rep said, "Hey, if you don't have a 1420, don't send it. and she had a 1390. And that was like, okay. And so she didn't send it, and she sent her grades and rigor, everything else, her essays, and she got into Tulane with some merit money. But they were very candid that we don't want to see a score under a 1420, so she kept it to herself, and she was accepted. So that's unusual, but Tufts, this is on their website. So I like seeing this. I also like policies. There are a few schools where they have a do no harm policy, that your test scores will only help you. They're not going to hurt you, which I think is very, very friendly and very nice. It takes away the confusion of, do I send or withhold? Because for many schools, you don't know, does this office care or not? Am I close enough to the mean score where this will help me or not? Auburn did something interesting, that for a long time they were optional after the pandemic. Then they shifted a couple years back to conditional required. If I have under a 3.6, I had to send my scores. Over 3.6, optional. And now their language is, it's pretty amazing. They strongly encourage, and they said that for this current cycle of admissions, students who apply without test scores, we're only allocating 5% of the pool under test optional. So 95% of kids are going to let in have test scores. Only 5% will be from the optional pool. So that's really wild. And then in 2027, everyone's required. So this is a period of transition. They're pivoting towards test required. But 5%, that's a small window for those kids. All right. Now, we also know that more kids are choosing to send scores, but using strategy. So again, like my niece, Ella, she had a 1390. She sent, if I Georgia was required, went to Georgia. Alabama, went to Alabama. I sent to USC and Columbia. She sent it to UVA. Did not send it to UNC, where her scores were a little bit low. Didn't send it to Tulane when they said don't send it. And it's understanding that same score can help you at these schools, it hurts you at these schools. And you want to really look at that middle 50 percentile and figure out, do my scores help or hurt? Am I a strong applicant, or are they relatively weak? And if it's relatively weak, don't send them. That's the rule. We are also seeing that test scores are on the rise, that more and more students are realizing, oh, even schools where it's optional can still help me. And also we're seeing schools like UT Austin go back test required, and Ohio State, and all the Florida schools, the Georgia schools, and that's driving in a lot of applications with test scores. And so we're seeing now the shift for non-first gen kids, that reporters are beating out the withholders. And we're going to see this trend continue. So, and I still believe that I know some kids who are academically so fantastic, and they just happen to have a hard time with the SAT, ACT. And for those kids, it is nice that there are pathways. And there, again, there are 2,000 schools that are test optional. And so there are many, many, many ways to get into school. But maybe there are 30 schools you can apply to, but there are hundreds of schools and dozens and dozens of very selective good schools where the test score is not required. So that is very nice for some kids who really have a hard time with testing. But there are certain groups where testing is more valid, more important, more valuable. Engineering applicants, again, they want to see that math score, just to make sure you can handle advanced math. Business majors, where you're going to be doing, all the accounting, but also the finance, which is derivative and calculus, and pricing derivatives out, and discounting cash flows, which I did years ago. You have to be able to do math, and so that's where the basic stuff on the SAT is a proxy for your math abilities. STEM students in general, computer science kids, math students, and it's the math score, honestly, is really pivotal. Unless you're applying to a writing program where that verbal score could be really, really helpful, unless you send them, of course, you got a 5s on AP Lang, AP Lit, other ways to showcase your skills in a standardized way. All right, I wrote an article back in August about engineering applicants and going through the top engineering programs in the country, and more of them are going back test required. Stanford, Caltech, Carnegie Mellon, Purdue, Johns Hopkins, Cornell, and the UCs. Again, UC Davis just said, we're really questioning now, this policy of test blind, because we're getting so many kids who can't do math, who are remedial out of the gate. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the regents at the UC system reconsider this test blind and at least go back test optional. And there could be a world where UC goes back test required, which was recommended by the faculty, actually, before they adopted the test blind. The same thing as Caltech. Caltech was test blind, and now the test required. So there is precedent for that. Additionally, Cooper Union, they said their engineering applicants, they're test required. All the military academies, like naval academies of third engineers, the academies are all test required. Worcester Poly, they very, very candidly spoke out and said, we are not using test scores, they're not helpful, and now we're going test blind for at least 8 years. And 3 years later, they're optional. And I wouldn't be surprised again if some of these schools go back test required, because especially schools that are technical, math-based, engineering-based, we're seeing a real push towards we need to see a strong math score to make sure you can handle the rigor of our program because it protects the kids. Otherwise, if they have to leave and transfer out, it's bad for institution, it's bad for the kids. So test scores can be protective, and that was the rationale from MIT. It's like we don't want to hurt these kids if they actually can't handle the work here, because grades again are less predictive. Grades are more inflated. So testing has more weight at the big selectives, the super elite, the elite privates, the public flagships. And I expect more schools like UT Chapel Hill to go back test required in a couple of years after UT and Ohio State, and the big state schools are really driving it as well. So let's do a quick survey of the two assessments, SAT, ACT, to give you a better understanding of the two tests. They look pretty darn similar these days. The SAT, it's a 2-hour, 14-minute test. The ACT, without science, 2 hours and 5 minutes. Science is optional, and we're seeing lots of kids not taking science. Right now, 2/3 of our students are taking science, 1/3 of our students are not. And I'll talk a little more about that. But in the science section distinguishes the ACT from the SAT. There is no science section on the SAT. Now, there have been some pretty big changes in both tests in the last 2 years, and we're still using old concordance tables. If you're trying to compare scores, it'll tell you a 1200 SAT concords to a 26 ACT, which may be off by about a point on the scale of the ACT. Maybe, a 1200 concords down to a 25, but it's not going to be a huge change. But in a year and a half, they're going to go ahead and do concordance to refresh and but given the fact that things have been changing. All right, the digital SAT, it's computer adaptive, which means how you perform on the baseline module will determine the adaptive module you get. So you have a baseline verbal, then the adaptive verbal. If I get more than a third right, I'm going to the hard module. If I get more than a third wrong, I'm going to the easier module. Then there's a 10-minute break. I do math, same thing, baseline math. If I do more than 2/3 right, I'm going to the hard math. Less than 2/3 right, I'm going to the easier math for the adaptive module. That's all. Now, the ACT is not adaptive. It's a linear test. It's a little bit shorter. They got rid of some items, but it doesn't change. So your test doesn't move at all, whether you're taking it digitally or on paper. And science is totally optional. And again, more and more kids are not taking it. It's not part of your composite or your super score. It'll be a separate standalone score. So you're going to say, I got a 32 on the ACT and I got a 31 science. It's not going to affect that composite score, which is the average of those three main subject areas. The speediness. The ACT has always been, since 1959, a faster test with more questions and less time per question. Although the new test is slightly less speedy, it's still speedier than the SAT. So that's meaningful. And there are more items. So for the verbal section on the SAT, there are 54 items on verbal, and the ACT, there are 86. For the total test, there are 98 items on the SAT, 131 on the ACT without science, and then 171 with science. That's meaningful. There are 8 experimental questions, 2 per section on the SAT, versus there are a lot more experimental questions on the. There are 29 experimental questions compared to the 8. So the ACT, because they're assessing things in big blocks like passages and vignettes, there's a whole passage on English that's experimental. There's a whole full passage on reading is experimental. There are 4 items on math, and then there's 1 whole science vignette. So there's more experimentation where items don't actually count on the ACT. Now, the 2 assessments, you have an option now as of actually last April, but now in September, both formats are the same. They're harmonized. You can take it on paper or on the computer. We at Applerouth, we like the ACT in paper format. So if you have the choice, take it on paper. If you're taking a school day test where there's no choice, computer's okay. And it's been getting better, but it's initially out of the gate, there were some problems, which they're slowly addressing little by little. The digital ACT, it's administered using Pearson's Test Nav, which isn't as good of an interface as College Board's Blue Book. And improvements are coming, but they're slow to come, and we still prefer paper. Bring your own device. I got an email this week from the ACT that finally in my marketplace, we can do bring your own device. Because before that, you were reliant upon the school to provide devices. But they're working on that, but it's not universally available and not available overseas. But this is something that the College Board has done for a couple years to great effect, and it's been very effective. So bring your own device is nice. And finally, the ACT is going to let you take it on a MacBook or a Chromebook or Windows and so forth. So that is getting better. One thing that's really wonky about the ACT is every item, you do highlights, and then you go to the next item, and your highlights disappear, which to me is just bad design. Additionally, you have to be tied to the internet for every item you advance forward. And that's a problem, because if the internet's slow or clunky, it's going to slow down your test. Versus the SAT, everything is saved onto your hard drive, and you only need Wi-Fi at the beginning and the end for a few seconds. So that's just a better design as well. So the SAT is currently a better digital test. Additionally, on the ACT, which is really kind of really silly, they point you in the direction of, like, certain paragraphs, one main point of the highlighted paragraph, but then you have to scroll up and down to find it. It doesn't actually direct you there. So people lose time trying to find where in the passage they want me to go, versus the SAT, they queue it up. It's just one question, one passage, then brand new one. So there are no more long form passages on the SAT. There are still long form on the ACT, and you're having to do some hunting and looking. So again, the College Board, the Blue Book is elegant. It's very simple, and I really do like their format that they're using. The Desmos calculator has been available on the SAT since its inception, back in 2023 with the PSAT in October, and then on the March test 2024. The ACT had a much weaker calculator, but they finally upgraded it in the past month, and they did a deal with Desmos too. So Desmos it's a very important if you're working on the SAT or the ACT, that you actually get comfortable if you're taking it on a computer with Desmos, because it's really a powerful graphing calculator. Although the ACT is limiting some of the Desmos functions, they're making you still figure out how to use trig, certain things that on the SAT, they're just letting you use it. So it's a more robust Desmos on the College Board's SAT. All right, so there we go. Now, in terms of timing is still more pressing on the ACT. And we see here, this was from research that came out from the ACT itself, looking at how many kids are finishing the sections. We see that for English and math, it didn't change. In math, you see we have the worst rates of completion. 50% of kids finished. A lot of kids, didn't have enough time, and so they're really rushing and racing trying to finish. But you see that with the enhanced test, which has arrived this year, more kids are finishing reading, and we see a nice pop in science, because they gave science, they gave an extra 10 minutes or so, and boom, more kids are finishing, which is really helpful. So the AC is speedier, but it has improved in the last year. So AC science, it's not really science. It's mostly reading, a little bit of math. It's not like an AP Chem, AP Bio test at all. And so many kids, even kids who are science oriented, are not taking AC science. And I believe within a few years, it'll actually go away, like we saw with the SAT essay. I don't think there's going to be a huge demand for this, especially as more and more schools come out and say, we're not going to use it, we're not going to require it. And then kids will just stop taking it. And you look at some of the data here, looking at the old one is orange, English, math, reading, and science. And the new enhanced one is blue, English, math, and reading. And look at the average scores. So look at like 4-year college enrolled kids. The average of that 0.6 million kids, the average score with science, 22.8, without 22.7. And at an individual level, there's not that much difference. We're seeing some kids have a 1 or 2 point difference with science, but typically, it's a fraction of a point. So it's 22.7 versus 22. It's 1/10 of a point, and that's not meaningful. And so that's because the ACT science section correlates so heavily with reading and math that for most kids, it's not really standing alone and giving you new information, that these things tend to rise and fall together. So for that reason, most kids are not going to need science. And I see more and more schools are going to be not requiring it in the future. Boston University is one of the weird ones. Say, you know what, we're test optional, but if you send an ACT score, you have to include science. They're one of the few in the country. Colleges who are not requiring science, like with Harvard, Stanford, Brown, Cornell, Georgia, and then you have almost 2,000 schools who haven't taken a position. And so that just means like they're not requiring it, obviously. And so, you know what? Composite scores now exclude science. Hundreds and hundreds of colleges haven't even given a policy update on it. There are some exceptions. I mentioned like Georgetown wants science, Pomona, BU, it's recommended for Duke. The Florida Public's required, now they dropped the requirement, it's optional. We believe, though, because there's still some uncertainty, that if you're taking the science, just take it one time. It's like, $5-10 more. It's only 40 minutes to do it once. Have a science score just in case a college says we require it late in the game, which would be unusual, but it could happen. So to me, it's just like an insurance policy, but don't take it every time because I don't think it's going to make a real difference. And it's no longer part of your composite. And so post-September, the science doesn't factor in. Here, it looks like it does, but it doesn't. So the composite score, 34. They got a kick at a 32 on math in December, 30 on science, 36 on English in September, 33 on reading. If that science counted, the composite would have been a 33, but it doesn't. So it's just there, but doesn't have any impact at all on the composite score. It's just a separate score. And there are a few kids left. They shouldn't really factor in anymore. Kids who only took the old ACT, their super scores will include science. But if you take any new ACTs starting in September going forward, then your super score and your composite will it'll all exclude the science section. But only kids who applied with only old tests. But now that's not a thing because every test from September, October, December, February, everything going forward is the enhanced, and that will instantly pull science out of your super score. All right, now Vandy has a do no harm policy. They said the Vandy calculated ST score will include the science if one, you take it, and two, if it helps. So I like that. I like the do no harm policies. It takes away some of the confusion. But super scoring, the old and the new, some of you out there, your kids may have taken the old one before September. And almost every school is going to super score. The ones who said no, Harvard, UT Austin, Brigham Young, Michigan State, Chapman, Colorado, and Rutgers. Then you have those 20 schools who said we will super score. Then you have 2,000 plus schools who have no opinion. And so this really stops being an issue in the next few months. Once, some of your kids may have taken the old and the new, but going forward, if you're taking it this calendar year, September going forward, it's all the new. So there is no mixing and matching formats. This is only a thing for a year of transition, and this slide goes away. All right, now overlap. These tests overlap about 80%. There's definitely a strong degree of overlap. SAT has more advanced reading. It has a reading level is around 11th grade reading level compared to 9th grade for the ACT. The math is more advanced on the ACT, more as a broader range of content. It's like shallow, but it goes very broad. You have to know a lot more topics on the ACT. The SAT is mostly algebra and advanced math. There's a little bit of geo, tiny bit of trigonometry, 1-2 questions. But the ACT has, again, broader math. They both have some analysis, a little bit of stats, nothing too serious. ACT has concepts you'll never see on the SAT, like matrix multiplication, ellipses, parabolas, domains and ranges of functions. So again, there's harder content that shows up intermittently on the ACT, but never shows up on the SAT, which is really more about functions and graphing and algebra and exponents. So the SAT math, it's you have your Desmos calculator. They're going to give you scratch paper, and you can also bring your own calculator for non-graphing functions. Desmos, really a big deal for the SAT, but also somewhat for the ACT. And you can like solve equations like this mathematically, solving for X or Y, or you plug them in and just graph them, and then they want the intersection, and so the answer is 3. So it's things like that where the graph or Desmos is really powerful and helpful. SAT verbal, it's a short little paragraphs of 100 or 50 words or less, one question. And the ACT, though, is still the long form, 10 questions, 700 words, different format still on that. The SAT, the reading goes in this order. They really reduced the amount of grammar. There's much less grammar. Now it's more reading. And so you're going through like words and context, ideas, evidence questions. Then you shift into grammar, boundaries, form, structure for, a good 5, 6, 7 questions. And then you get to these expressions of ideas, which is, back to some synthesis. But it's, well, all that's to say is that grammar is less important than it used to be, mechanics, grammar usage. And reading is a bigger deal when they combine the two sections. They combined reading and writing, but it's mostly reading. And now the two modules, let me explain the easy and hard modules. I mentioned that if you get 2/3 right, you go to the hard module. Here's how this looks roughly. So the baseline module looks like this, where they give you a couple level 1, very easy questions. They give you a couple, 2 or 3 really hard questions, but you're mostly living in the middle. And if I get more than a third wrong, boom, I'm going to an easier module, which is skewed more towards easy questions. I'm going from not 2 level 1 questions, now I have 7. And then level 4s, I only have 1. So it's still a mixture, but the mixture skews easy. If, however, I get more than 2/3 right on the baseline, I'm going to a hard module where I'm not going to see 7 level 1 questions. I'm going to see 1, and I'm going to skew towards 3s and 4s. So that's just kind of how this pans out. Additionally, there's something called item response scoring, where different items have different weights. And for that reason, like question 13 might count a lot more than question 9, which has never happened before until this, for 90 some years. A point was a point, but now it's not. And then the score give back, they don't ever tell you, did you miss 13? Did you miss 7? Did you miss 9? They don't even tell you, did I go to the hard module, the easy module for math or for verbal? But you know for a fact, if you get over a 670, you went to the hard module, because you're capped at like around roughly a 660. If you get more than a third wrong and you go to the easy module, you're already limited by how many you missed in the first section, even if I answer everyone right. So we've experimented with that. So that's what your score sheet looks like. Not as robust. And honestly, if you're doing practice tests, it's better to go to a company like ours or someone who has much more robust feedback. That you missed number 13, here's why you missed 13, because this feedback really can't help you prep, except for very rough, I need help with algebra, but not what question did I miss and why. So we have really good feedback. We have 4 digital tests, and every student gets a free test. They're pretty useful. So you want to practice the 7 SATs on the Blue Book app. You want to get ready for Desmos, practice drill. And in terms of, you want to get a baseline on both. That's really critical. And compare them. If I get, let's say, again, a 26 on the ACT and a 1220 on the SAT, I'm in the range of indifference. The range of indifference is around 60 points, because there's 30 points of error on each test. But if I go beyond that, let's say I get a 26 on the ACT, but I get a 1300 SAT, I'm 100 points higher. And then I could take the test 10 times in a row, and I probably do better every single time on the SAT. So there's no error. I'm beyond the margin of error. And so beyond 70 points, go with that test. If you're within the margin, and then go with your preference, because that could switch on a given day. Ideally, your testing plan should have 3 tests officially. Many of our kids are 1 and done, some are 2 and done, but because super scoring and because of testing gains, kids tend to do better on the 2nd and 3rd test. Things that matter, practice tests matter. Spreading things out over time, it's better to prep for 2 months than for 10 days. Starting early is better than waiting to late on your senior year. The more time you put in, the better you do. Having a goal is also impactful. The testing plan is pretty basic. For the first time ever, we had a September SAT. So now we have, over the course of the calendar year, we have 8 SATs and we have 7 ACTs. So now there's a span of 5 months in a row, August, September, October, November, December, where every single month I can take an SAT, which is new. I mean, I remember there was no August, there was no September, there was a massive gap. But now kids can test over the summertime, and many of our top kids do. They prep over the summer. But you can prep, there are many ways to do it now. Some kids do summer prep. Some kids, do it in the winter. Lots of ways to do it. And if you do a prep class in the summer and you're going to take it later, just make sure you ideally go and lock in a test to lock in some of those gains. And make sure if you come back to it in 4 months that you refresh it. Don't go into a test cold. And one of my rules is I want everyone taking a full-time practice test within a month of any official test. And now those full tests are just shorter. The SAT used to be a 5-hour test. Now it's 2 hours, which is one of the reasons also we're seeing a lot more testing during the school day. And about 2/3 of all kids taking the ST took it during the school day, because it's only 2 hours and 14 minutes. That's really incredible versus, again, Used to be 8 to 1 o'clock when you had the essay in 10 sections. So very different test. Super scoring, they're going to combine your best verbal and math from different administrations, and that's your super score. Same thing with the ACT. They do it automatically now. If you take it more than once, they generate a super score for you and send it automatically, when you send your scores. And so, and science is not ever, again, part of the super score. That's just a rule. You can report it and send it, make sure they get it. But again, we don't know how much science is going to matter. And a lot of it, like the STEM schools, don't even require it. So we'll see what happens. I really believe science is going to decline in number of kids and eventually peter out. Then the question is, do I send my scores? Well, get your baseline scores first. Look at your baseline scores, look at how they compare. And if you're looking at schools, like, very selective schools, they want, super high scores. And let's say you have a 21 on the AST, and the schools you're looking at, they want a 33. That's a pretty big lift. In that case, I probably apply to those schools, test optional. But let's say I'm looking at a school that wants a 31 and I open with 27. That's the range. 4 points, that's less than our average gain for a student. So you want to look at what's the gap between where I'm starting from and where I want to go. Go with your strengths. If you're in that middle 50 range or on the upper end of it, send the score. But Rick said if you were in the bottom quartile, probably wouldn't send. He used to be the missions director at Tech here in Atlanta, a very tough school. And here's an example. So the Buffs, Colorado, they're middle 50. That's half of the kids. This is like the enrolled class. Half of the kids scored in the middle 50 percentile, scored between an 1170 and a 1380. That means a fourth of the kids are above a 1380, or the 14s and thereabouts. And you have a quarter of the kids 1160 and below. So if you are above the middle score, you always send it every single time. 1280, 1300, 14, send those scores. If I'm below that 1160, I probably wouldn't send it. The only exception would be if I'm first generation and I'm like my 1160 is the best in the school, and I come from a school where test scores are very low, or if I'm a poorer county or less represented county, then in that case my score still may be the best of my group. In which case that would be a different situation than if you're a standard feeder school for the college. The real question is that third quartile. Because if my grades, let's say I have an unweighted 4.0 and I have a ton of rigor, I got 11 APs, everything is fabulous, great recs, but my testing so my grades and rigor are superlative, but my testing is like an 1180. I probably want them to evaluate me only on the merits of my rigor and my strong GPA. And also if I have other APs, I have a bunch of 4s and 5s, send those, but withhold that 1280. If on the other hand, let's say I'm an engineering applicant, I want to be, and my verbal wasn't that strong. My verbal was 500, but my math was a 740. In that case, I'm applying to an engineering program, I want them to see that 740 math. So I would definitely send it, even though my total composite score is in the third quartile. And then, if I'm an average student, my grades aren't the best, but my test score, let's say I have a 3.6, a little bit of rigor, but not maybe 3 classes of rigor. But then I have a 1260. I probably sent it. I'm right shy of that midline versus an 1170. I'd probably withhold it. So there's some back and forth, and you talk to your guidance counselor, your college counselors to help you get some guidance about what the Colorado Buffs want from my school. Some of them, they're going to be using SCOIR, SCOIR, or Naviance, looking at scattergrams, CapEx, looking at seeing, where do I fit, especially specific to your high school. And I said, you know what, they really are letting in more kids with 1300s than with 1180, so I probably withhold that score, and they'll help give you that guidance. So we're going to pivot now. It's 8:44. We'll do a quick little poll here, just one question or 3 questions. If you want us to contact you, if you want any help, any resources, we're happy to be there for you. And then if you want any kind of follow-up from us. But now I want to open things up to some Q&A, because I like the Q&A, and we have 15 minutes. So I'm going to open this thing up. Here's my Q&A. So go ahead and type in the Q&A window anything I have not yet answered that you came tonight and wanted information about, and hopefully I can be helpful about testing, about anything. Take your time. I'll take a sip of my tea. And if there are no questions, then we'll leave a little early, but typically there are at least one or two questions. Okay. Yes. All right. We have the question. Other than a school that might require the science section, is there any disadvantage to taking it? No, none. No. If you're curious, um, or if your kid's good at it, but in terms of the impact, again, it's no longer part of composites. It's gonna be a separate score, and we don't yet know how much it matters. But if your kid is, let's say your composite to 33, 30, and you have a 33 science, yeah, and you can find this out taking a practice test. I mean, they're giving kids more time per question, more kids are finishing it. But there's very little downside. There are just some kids who don't want to have to worry about it. Some kids are focusing only on English and math because you have to learn, how to address the question types. But there's no downside besides time. And some kids are good at it. All right. With many finding difficulty finding internships or jobs, even for the best universities and with good majors, is it worth striving to get into a good college? I still, this is so interesting. I'm writing an article about this right now. And I think prestige, I think there's still something to be said for it, especially schools that are very prestigious. But many people, it's like if they can't get in the very top schools, they're going to go to their state school and skip some of the middle tier and just go for the best deal economically and financially. But I still believe we do know the lifetime value of a college education is still holds up for us high school kids, even though some of the kids now are struggling getting a first job. Looking at, it might take them a year or so, a little more time, but eventually over the lifetime value, kids definitely do better economically with a degree. And in the ROI matters tremendously of which major. STEM kids tend to do better, than a education major. There's a whole range of different income levels and different earning pathways based on the major you choose. And so I still think, a good major and a good university is still beneficial. So I'm still a believer in higher ed. Is the new ACT more difficult than the prior version? No, it is actually, it's the same test essentially. What they did, and let me qualify that one thing. One of the things they did for the math section, there used to be 60 items for math. Now there are 45. All they did essentially was cut out the first 15 items. So it didn't get harder at the end, but you're jumping into a test at item 15, 16 versus item number 1. So a lot of the really easy content that would warm you up, like the giveaway questions, are gone. So in that regard, the average level of questions is higher because they culled the first 15, but the last 40, the remaining questions are essentially identical. They didn't change content, they didn't change the kind of questions, and the same thing with the passages for reading and for reading in English and math. So, and the science isn't any hard. So it really is very, very, very similar content and not harder material. Just they're giving kids more time per question, and you have fewer questions. So it's actually in some ways an easier test. How much should my score increase after a year? If there isn't a big increase, how do you address that? After a year, well, it depends upon, have you been prepping in earnest for the test? Are you looking at a year simply of learning in school versus I put in time getting better on the assessment? Because that's meaningful. Like there's definitely, my level of reading, my level of math. Because also the level of math on the level of reading on the ACTs, ninth grade level of reading, the math stops at pre-cal. If you're already in calculus or differential equations, you're not doing relevant math. And like the SAT really is algebra 2, a little bit, tiny bit of trig. So if you're doing advanced math, you're not doing relevant math. So if you are prepping actively and you're doing the problem sets and practice tests and not doing well, you have to, revisit the way you're studying, how you're studying. Are you actually studying the errors you're making? Are you being very deliberate? And, because you don't just like take practice tests, but stop and study every single mistake you're making, understand why. Why did I choose B, not A? Why did I fall for the trap? And you'll definitely improve. Students will get better if they do deliberate practice, focusing on their errors. That's critical versus just learning or being passive with studying. In general, is the ACT recommended for kids with extra time accommodations? Is the pencil version preferred over digital versions? If you have extra time, you're better served on the ACT because the College Board really did give kids a lot more time per question. And so extra time is less essential for kids with differential processing speed. But on the ACT, it's still a speedier test. Like time and a half makes a big difference, big difference. Is pencil preferred? Yes. I would go pencil with time and a half on the ACT. That's the way I play it. All right. Do you suggest taking a break between exams? No, I don't. You don't need to. Because especially like with the SAT, the feedback they give you is nothing. It's minimal. The ACT, you have to wait 6 weeks. But I think there's benefit in doing momentum and just using your practice tests. And they're giving you back your score back within 13, 14 days. It comes pretty quick. So I actually like kids stacking. Like when they have momentum, they're cooking. We take November, we take December. Should the next try be March or August? I mean, it could, but unless there's some compelling reason, like suddenly you're in your big season, you're in your athletics, or you're the lead in the school play. If you can keep going without taking a break, I think, unless the kids are burnt out, I think I like doing 3 back to back to back, and then you're finished, you're done, moving on. Some kids need a break, or it's their season, and they come back, and that's fine too. But personally, I like if I have the momentum and I'm feeling good, keep banging it out. That's my experience. All right, what are your thoughts on AST writing? Worthless, not important. It's about a quarter million kids take it. A lot of them are international kids proving their language. They're taking the TOEFL or the IELTS, but otherwise you have school districts where they're requiring it for kids as a way of measuring the net writing ability for the school, different classes, different teachers. But in terms of as a college admission test, no, don't bother with the writing. That isn't I'm assuming you mean like the essay. The essay is optional, and just I wouldn't think about it because the College Board had an essay, they dropped it, and after the College Board dropped their essay, then it really became very extremely optional and really very little impact or effect. Wouldn't it make sense to take both the SAT and AST? My student isn't sure. I think it makes a ton of sense to take a baseline test for both, and then go with your better test. Or if you're in the neutral zone, that 60-point range of difference, the margin of error, then go with the student's preference. Because there are some differences in terms of how you prep for one or the other. And in my experience, kids who really focus their attention end up getting bigger gains. Colleges you don't get extra points for taking both tests. And we're getting kids into every school in the country with one test. You don't need both. But I think it's critical that you take a dual baseline because some kids out of the gate, without any preparation, they're going to score 100 points higher on the SAT or AST without any work. And so I want to take advantage of that. So never ever just jump onto one without doing a practice. And it's only 2 hours. Over the course of a weekend, you take a 2-hour test on Saturday, 2-hour Sunday, and then you go forward. So it used to be a 5-hour test and a 3.5-hour test. It was 8 hours. Now it's just 4 hours, so it's much easier for kids. Is the new ACT more difficult? No, it's not. The new ACT is not more difficult. It's just it's shorter test. It's a little less speedy. And I actually think it's totally fine. Our kids they're doing great on the test. Is the paper version recommended for students with accommodations? Yes. If you have the chance to take paper or digital ACT, take paper because the format it's not there yet. There's still some wonkiness, and also doing the graphs. I'd rather people do graphs and measure on paper. Eventually, they may force you to take digital. Or they may have some major incentive and price it very attractively. But if I'm given the chance, I would do paper every time on the ACT until that option goes away. Where can I find a full practice test for the ACT? Well, we have Applerouth has them, and you go on act.org, and they have a full practice test as well. And so act.org and Applerouth, and also there's a red book, and you can buy tests on the red book. There are 5 new tests, that's like $30 on Amazon. So it's the AC official guide, which has practice tests. So you have them online, you have an Applerouth, you have them on Amazon. Tutoring, gotcha. And so this is for Elizabeth. In that case, if you've been working and tutoring and things aren't moving, we got to shake things up. Either it's going to be a change in tutor, like something's not working. And in my experience, if there's not meaningful gains of progress, we got to get a better fit. For one, I may look back and see when you took the baseline test for the SAT, ACT, were they pretty close? If you're prepping for a year on one test and things aren't moving, I may go back and revisit because again, when you're prepping for one, you're prepping for the other. There might be at this point you've had some gains in the other test, but also I would definitely look closely at doing a pivot, doing a shift, and we do tutor swaps if things aren't gelling. because that's enough time to see some meaningful gains. Do you offer one-on-one guidance services? We offer test preparation, and we refer people if you want consulting and college counseling. We have tons of partners who we can give you names based on where you are geographically, if you want in person, or online if you're open to someone who works via Zoom. All right. Are the SAT scores on a standardized curve? Like, could someone's score vary based on how many students test on a given day and how they did, or is it purely based on their performance individually? So you're not competing against your cohort on a given day. Like tests are scaled, and there's like score equating between tests. But even if there's like a smaller group who takes it in October versus November, you're not competing directly. Like you're competing with the level of difficulty of the test and then make adjustments. But it's not going to be based on, they're not norming it. Tests are normed earlier. They're not norming it each time on the group. There is something, let me throw this out. So in terms of item response theory and differential item analysis, they are calculating the weight of different items based on the total population of students. So let's say they give a question, and they look at this population of how many kids get that item right or wrong. That can affect the weight of that item. And so in terms of its algorithmic, that's new, that's distinct, because the test now is totally digital, and they can calculate instantly how many kids got this right or wrong all of the whole country within seconds. And so they can actually change the weighting. But in terms of the totals, so in that way, like in some ways, yes, but that, but not in the typical way of I'm competing globally. My 560 would be a 730 on a different day. But there is some balancing based on the performance on given items, which is new. That's item response theory. Okay. The AC is not adaptive. No. AC is linear. It's a straight linear test, one item, one raw point, one scale point. There's no differential weighting. It doesn't adapt, doesn't change at all. It's just like they cut the number of items down, and it's a straight linear test. Versus the SAT, it is section adaptive. And so you have your baseline section. If I do great, I'm going to the hard section. If I do under 2/3 right, I'm going to the easier section. That's it. That's the only adaptation that you're going to get. All right. Oh, sure. All right. What are realistic gains? For the kids who do 20 hours of prep on the ACT, they're getting like 5 points. We always get a lot more points with like the English and the writing. It's relatively easier. And now that we're doing 3 sections, there's less content for a lot of kids. For the SAT, I think it's around 120 points that we're picking up, looking at for our private tutoring kids. So yeah, but again, there are big ranges. Do you score higher if you go to the higher section of the SAT? So there is some overlap. So if let's say you're getting between a 440 and a 650, you could have gone either way. Okay, I could have gone to the hard section and tanked it. I could have gone to the easy section and crushed it, and I can't tell the difference. I can have a 620 and I could have gone to either section. There is some tell though, because like the questions are going to be a lot harder for some, for the math section especially. But if I get below a 440, I went to the easier section because I'm going to get so many points from the getting 2/3 right that I can't go below that, even if I tank every question. And in a similar fashion, if I get over a 670, I went to the hard section, because if I miss a third of the questions on the introduction section, I'm just capped. I've already missed 7 questions. I can't, my ceiling is now a 670. So if I want a higher ultimate score, yes, you're going to have to end up going to the advanced, to the more advanced module if I want to score on the 700. So yeah, but there is that middle thing where it's a bit befuddled, where it could have gone either way. I could have gone hard and done poorly, or gone easy and done very well. And then I can't differentiate that. Okay. All right. And also, but Charlotte, in terms of the gains, if you want, we could talk to someone, at Applerouth and look at, our averages. We have all that. But, I think, and there's a range, obviously. Some kids do extremely well. I know someone who's picked up 7 points on the ACT, a friend of mine, actually, his daughter. And so it's like, okay, there are ranges of outcomes. But on average for private tutoring, we're getting like around 120 SAT, about 5 points ACT. Those are our averages for a couple thousand kids we work with. Actually, more than a couple thousand. We work with over 10,000 kids each year around the country. All right. Are there any other questions? It's 9 o'clock. I think I've answered everything in my queue. Well, in that case, have a great night, everybody. Thanks for being here. I hope everyone learned something. Feel free to share this. And if you have questions, please reach out to us, info@Applerouth. Want to make sure you have the information you need to make good informed decisions. And everyone, thanks for joining for the hour. All right. Have a good night. Bye-bye.